I'm going to offer a little reflection. When I was in college, a long, long time ago, when I was a freshman, I would take these kids out on wilderness trips. Maggie and I both did this, and Maggie and I both participated in these wilderness trips when we were freshmen before uh, college. And we would go up to northern Wisconsin, and there was a part where we would be in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And these trips were designed to be especially sparse. This was the early 90s. And if you remember the early 90s, there was this growing movement to sort of commercialize camping. This was like the rise of REI. And there was this growing sense that you had to spend a lot of money on gear. You could spend a lot of money on comfort and go out into the woods. And so this camp was sort of intentionally pushing back against this idea that you had uh, to be incredibly comfortable and have everything you need out in the woods. And so the backpacks were old and the canoes were heavy and aluminum. And the food was particularly sparse. There would be some dried fruit and some gruel for dinner, and lunch almost always for the 14 days of this trip. Lunch was almost always these like little hockey pucks called hardtack. Um, and they were sort of, each one of them, is probably only this big, but it might have weighed, I don't, like 7 pounds, which is an exaggeration, but it was incredibly dense, and it was hard to get through, but it had a huge amount of nutrition for all this really heavy duty physical labor that these kids were involved in. Um, and and so inevitably, in every trip that we would take, even when I was a student going out, by day 4 or 5, you would start to hear these elaborate food fantasies that would arise from the group. You'd be walking through this dense forest, and someone would just like shout out like double bacon cheeseburger, and then there would be this whole sort of reverie and reflection on all of the best burgers that people had ever had, and there'd be arguments about waffle fries versus curly fries, and all the things that sort of go along uh, with hamburgers, as just one example. And I remember when I was a leader, and we'd always have co-leaders. I remember after one of these extended reminiscing reveling in food, I remember thinking, I had a conversation with this person, and we were talking about whether we should allow people to reminisce about what they don't have. Are we just allowing them to sort of torture themselves? Should we really try to ground them only in the present, and kind of kind of squash this kind of imagination and memory? And we came to the conclusion that no, that it was like completely appropriate, completely healthy, a great way to sort of cope with the trauma of hockey pucks for lunch, was to be able to use their imagination. And so, we would just pile on and ask about ice cream treats, and ask people to kind of go there. Um, and I think about how that plays out, sort of like in times of deprivation, using memory and imagination. I think about in the Bible how the Jewish people are doing this, especially when they are exiled. So you remember 600, 700 years before Jesus, the Assyrians and the Babylonians, they conquer Israel, and they haul most people into captivity. And when people are in this foreign land in time of great trauma, they are remembering the days of old. They're remembering temple worship, the great temple that David's son Solomon built. They're remembering their vineyards. They're remembering their rituals, their practices. They're remembering the stories of how God had saved them and had been present to them in their homeland, on their soil, in their promised land, bringing them out of Egypt and helping them settle in this really rich part of Palestine. And so I think about how now we, in many ways, we are a people in exile. We are a people who have been pulled out of our locations, our homeland of worship, which is for most of us, for many of us, is the church. And we are in this place of disorientation and dislocation. Um, we are cut off. Even I here I'm in the physical building, but as I was saying earlier, my voice is echoing through a completely empty church. Even I, who sit in the nave, still sense that deep sense of dislocation. And so I want to leave space for us to remember and to reminisce and to use our imaginations, even in this time of deprivation and in this time of exile. I want to ask you, what are you missing most about our gathering together? And maybe that's on Sunday mornings. Maybe that's weekday gatherings. Maybe that's gatherings outside of a nave, and maybe that's fellowship in people's homes. Um, what are you missing most? I was thinking about this question for myself, and I, what I'm missing most, I think, right now, what I'm keenly aware of right now is that um, that words only take us so far. And right now, we have words, we have some music, but we have words. But we're in a sacramental tradition. So in a sacramental tradition, we believe that the physical is deeply intertwined with the spiritual. So bread and wine and oil on a forehead and babies in water and passing the sign of the peace. I mean, like, we used to do this radical thing where you would shake hands with like total strangers for like 3 minutes all over the place. Uh, I'm missing this sort of physically embodied dimension of our faith. That's something that's sort of hitting me in particularly hard right now. And so I want to allow us some space to be able to do that reminiscing. But at the same time, I want us to also, at least for me, I'm also trying to use this time of exile to imagine how to encounter God in new circumstances and in a new environment. Um, because these times of exile are often times of transformation, whether or not we want to be transformed or not. If you think about some of some of the Jewish people's deepest growth was in exile. If you remember, Judaism makes this enormous pivot in the midst of their captivity. They make this enormous pivot from encountering God primarily in temple worship. They pivot and they say, well, how do we encounter God when we don't have access to Jerusalem and we don't have access to the temple? And they land in this place where we can actually encounter God right where we are right now through living a holy life. And so you have this rise of what's called rabbinic Judaism, where you have rabbis and teachers who begin to tell people how you can follow the law and you can connect with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob right where you are without these dimensions of the faith that you're missing. And Jesus, of course, is in that long line of rabbis that are developed over the next 500 years. And so, I want us to be able to think about that the ways that we're in this time of exile, and that we can. So, like, when I'm thinking about myself, and I'm thinking about that physical dimension of the faith and how I don't have that right now in church or in our gatherings, I'm trying to think a little bit more of when I share a meal, like when I make a meal, or even I just sit down with other people. I'm trying to think about, how is this sort of a sacrament in some ways? How is this a sacred, holy time to prepare this food, to share this food, even if I'm eating by myself? You can think about all of this great web of spiritual energy that has gone to create this food. There's a car alarm going off somewhere outside. Um, so I have a couple questions for you. I have a couple questions for you, and I did want to just break into a little bit of time of discussion. Um, what in this time of exile? What do you miss about gathering as a church, gathering in real life, in as a community live? What do you miss? And in this time of exile, what is spiritually nourishing you right now? In this time of exile, what is spiritually nourishing you right now? What do you miss? And where are you finding God? What nourishes your spirit now?